Hello, I'm Mike from the University of Denver, and I will provide a brief overview on the organizational change model for my graduate class, Leading Volunteer Programs with a DEI lens. The change model I selected was Awake to Woke to Work, building a race equity culture, written by Equity in the Center. Um, What are the major goals of this model? The major goals of this model are building a race equity culture, one that is focused on proactive counteraction of race inequities inside and outside of the organization. How does this approach propose to facilitate DEI organizational change? This article expressed DEI organizational change using the race equity cycle. The race equity cycle provide guidance how organizations go through a cycle of change as they transform from a white dominant culture to a race equity culture. These changes include increased representation, a stronger culture of inclusion, and the application of a race equity lens to how organizations and programs operate. The data lever process identifies three stages that helps organizations manifest a race equity culture. The three phases are awake, woke, and work. The awake stage, the primary goal is representation, with efforts aimed at increasing the number of people of different race backgrounds on boards and on the workforce. The work stage, the primary goal is inclusion and internal change in behaviors, policies, and practices. The organization accomplishes this by focusing on culture and on creating an environment where everyone is comfortable sharing their experiences and equipped to talk about race, equity, and inequalities. The work stage, the primary goal is integration of a race equity lens into all aspects of the organization. This involves internal and external systems change and regularly administering a race equity assessment to evaluate processes, programs, and operations. The data lever process requires organizations to implement racial equity in the following sectors: senior leaders, individuals in a formal leadership role, managers, individuals who oversee operations of teams, board of directors, governing body of an organization, community, population served by the organization, learning environment, investment in staff capacity, data, metrics to drive improvements and focus, organizational culture, and shared values, assumptions, and beliefs. What assumptions about change are embedded in this model? Well, I will have to start with the racial equity becomes part of the organization's DNA once they fully commit to the race equity culture. The organization will grow and move beyond special initiatives and task force groups for full integration of race equity in every aspect of its operations and programs. So once the race equity culture is implemented, they can move away from these initiatives and committees and everything that where they is pretty much forcefully trying to forcefully including a diverse work environment in the organization. What is strong about this approach? This approach requires an organization to eliminate policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes based on race and to replace them with ones that promote and sustain race equity. What about this approach did you find most helpful and most challenging or concerning? Um, I appreciate how the model emphasized race equity over diversity. For example, the model illustrated the term diversity has been so frequently used and misused that it no longer communicates a clear definition for racial inclusion. Diversity is often focused exclusively on representation of diverse individuals as expressed in numbers and percentages. The term diversity does not always take into account how personal and professional inequalities are experienced by people of color. The most challenging and concerning aspects of the model is the white dominant workforce may not be willing to surrender or share power and resources to minorities. They can racially blind spot responses like everything works well, so why should we change? And they can voice that opinion at high profile meetings to to leadership and their peers that looks like themselves. What tools or ideas from this model will you add to your professional toolbox? Um, I would start with the data lever process before any work can begin, in which is the awake, woke, and work process. So the awake is, bringing culture and difference and background to the workforce. The woke is, implementing policy, and the work is just administering the process. That's the execution phase. Um, While this process was not developed strictly for volunteer programs and organizations, how applicable is this change process model to a volunteer organization? Again, the awake, woke, work change process is applicable to volunteer organizations to recruit people of color and optimize their talents. Racially diverse staff, a racially diverse staff helps communicate with the organization stakeholders in their environment, and also the board members should represent the workforce. So you want the workforce to somewhat simulate or to simulate its stakeholders in their environment. That gains more acceptance from the from their customers, and if the board members represent the workforce, it will be easier for the workforce to communicate with the leadership and express grievances or to provide opinions. This concludes my portion of this assignment. I look forward to your comments.